The presidential election and the role issues regarding race may have played in voters' decisions. We're joined now by author and Vanderbilt University African-American Studies professor, Mr. Michael Eric Dyson. Thank you so much for joining us. How much of a role do you think that Vice President Harris's race and gender played in the decision that some made to vote against her or just outright sit it out?
The constant and relentless harping on her race in a negative fashion, in a pejorative way, by both the president and vice president to be, Vice President to be Vance and President-elect Donald Trump, was certainly impactful and effective. It was destructively effective, but nonetheless, so it created a concern about her identity, who she was as a Black woman, her quote, recent embrace of her Blackness, seeming as if she had changed course in the middle of the flow. And as a result of that, he was able to effectively create doubt in some people's minds about whether or not a Black woman would be capable of duly occupying the office of the American presidency.
But as you know, many voters say, look, it came down to one thing only, the economy. The cost of eggs is too high. It had nothing to do with her race and gender. So why do you think that, how would you respond to that argument?
I'm sure earlier versions of white supremacy articulated through, presidential campaigns had an argument when Jim Crow was at its height, when lynching was at its height, when the effective rape and pillage and plunder of Black culture was at its height. I'm sure they also had some good ideals economically that might have played out. So it is a red herring and a false equivalency to say that on the one hand, I could ignore all of the racist cant that was being perpetuated by the other side because I really wanted to embrace concerns about the economy. If one is demoralizing and humiliating a human being, that ought to raise questions about the moral temperature in the room, so to speak. And to ignore all of that to say, hey, I'm more concerned about my pocketbook than I am about the conscience of the nation is quite unreasonable.
One of the numbers that stood out to me from election night was 71%. 71% of the electorate was white. Now, that number actually jumped 4 points from the last presidential election. The trend historically has been that the electorate is getting less and less white.
Right.
What that says is, because our country is becoming more diverse, so what that says is a lot of minorities simply did not show up to vote. In addition, we also know a lot of minorities did vote for Trump, some at the highest margins we've ever seen. So why do you think that is?
Well, first of all, when we look at those numbers in terms of 71%, let's flip it this way statistically. A lot more white people showed up out of fear and resentment that their numbers would be diminished, if you will, in the culture. We know that by 2035 and beyond, that this will be a majority-minority country. So there was a great deal of fear stoked in white people about their diminishing presence in the population. So that scared a lot of them out of their houses as well. And yes, of course, there were increased numbers of Latinos and African-American people who went for Trump. And as a result of that, not overwhelmingly, but enough, of course, to sway the balance.
Well, Latinos, it was pretty overwhelming. Latinos, it was.
Yeah, it was pretty darn high. But among African-American people, not as much. So we could ask of Latinos, given a man who is deeply opposed to both immigration on the one hand and to a Latina identity on the other. Think about Mexicans who were considered to be rapists and the SO countries that Mr. Trump spoke about. So despite the manifest expression of racial bigotry, Latinos en masse went for him. Now, some of that has to do with conservative cultural and especially religious values about abortion. And given the disproportionate numbers of Latinos who are Catholic, that would have been a serious consideration for many of them. And then buying into the belief that those immigrants that were coming were also undermining my position as a well-established Latino here. So the intra-racial, intra-ethnic division was certainly pronounced among Latinos for sure.
Professor Michael Eric Dyson, we thank you so much for your time.
Thanks for having me.